Okay, welcome everybody to day 2 of the River's second webinar for young researchers, Nature and its Rights. Just for your information, you can follow the event live on Facebook as well. It's shared on River's Facebook page. So yeah, nice to have everybody here. Yesterday we had a Spanish day, and today our session is going to be in English. Thank you for everybody for joining us today. Digno and I are super happy to see all the participants on the same screen after so long of planning this. We're very much looking forward to this session, to hear, to learn, and to discuss about human-nature relationships from very different angles. And today we have contributions from the US, from Colombia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we're happy to have with us Lauren Tarr, Juan Antonio Samper, Julia Torres, Peter Doran, Catalina Andrew, Botero, and Jérémie, Gilbert. My name is Stella Terjung. I'm a master's student of human rights studies at Lund University, and I'm currently conducting a research internship at the Rivers ERC project. So I've been in Madrid since September, and I'll be moderating you guys through today's session. So the structure, just a few words about it, will be as follows. So we have 3 presentations followed by a comment each and a break after the first 2. And if you in the audience have any questions throughout, feel free to post them in the Q&A chat immediately after each presentation, and we will hopefully have time to discuss them immediately after each session. And for all of those who didn't join yesterday, as a full recap, we had 3 fascinating presentations and discussions on the Earth System Law, on nature as a victim in the Colombian armed conflict, on women's activism and collective rights in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And the recording you can find on River's YouTube channel, which is called River's ERC Project. So if you type that in, I'm sure you'll find it. And before we move to the first session, I'll first hand it over to the principal investigator of Rivers. Say a few words of welcome. Lieselot, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Stella, for this beautiful introduction of the second day of the second colloquium of young researchers, Nature and its Rights. And I'm very pleased and very delighted as principal investigator of this research project Rivers to welcome you all the presenters, all the commentators, everyone who is joining us online from different parts of the world to this second day. I'm really happy to see this happening again, this colloquium that we are organizing as Rivers Project. It has the goal to create a space of reflection and dialogue and discussion among what we call young researchers. So researchers who are still in the beginning of their research. They are doing their master thesis or their PhD thesis. And this is actually the second year that we are doing this, and there was an idea of Digno last year to start doing this kind of webinar. So I'm extremely grateful that everyone was so enthusiastic to accept our invitation to participate yesterday and also today. And it is a really fascinating poster that Digno and Stella were able to put together, because we are really trying to create as a Rivers project South-North dialogue. And I think this is the first time that we are really able to do this, even though it's online with 7 presenters and 6 commentators from different parts of the world, based in Europe, based in Latin America, even based in Asia, non-indigenous, indigenous researchers all together during these 2 days. And for those who don't know the Rivers project yet, I just share a few words about this research project. It is a 5-year research project financed by the European Research Council as a starting grant, and we are developing it here at the University Carlos III in Madrid in the Department of Social Science. It is a project that has as main research question to what extent international human rights law can come to grips with pure legal water realities, and we are focusing with an international and an interdisciplinary team on 4 contexts. We are focusing on Guatemala, Nepal, Colombia, and also the United Nations human rights system. and you can find much more information about the work, about the progress, all the activities that we are doing on our website. And I also would like to share with you, as some of the presentations yesterday and also today are looking into more issues of nature and post-conflict or transitional justice societies, that that we are organizing with my colleague Peter Doran, who is also participating today, and with another colleague, Jonathan Lelyblad. We are organizing a special issue for the leading journal, International Journal of Transitional Justice. It's a call for papers on the specific topic of transitional justice and nature, a curious silence. The deadline for submitting papers is next year, the 1st of June, but we are organizing a webinar in February, on the 9th of February, for people who would be interested to present a brief draft version. And we will send out soon the call to participate in this webinar. The deadline, I think, if I'm correct, is the 21st of January to submit a brief abstract, and then we will organize the panel between Peter, Jonathan, and myself. And to finish or to wrap up this brief welcoming word, I would really express my biggest gratitude to Stella and Digno for organizing this 2-day of colloquium. I know that it has been really hard work, a lot of preparation, coordination, while I and my other team members were in Guatemala together with the Colombian researchers, finally meeting up and discussing our progress doing our research in Guatemala and Colombia. In the meantime, Stella and Digno were still preparing everything here from Madrid and then in Paris. So it has been amazing, and I'm really extremely grateful for all the work that you have been doing. The preparation, all the flyer, the invitations and so, and without your work and effort and enthusiasm for this topic and for this colloquium, this would not have been able to do. So thank you so much, Digno and Stella, for all the work. Now I hand over to Stella, and I'm looking forward to all the presentations and the discussions, because yesterday was an extremely interesting day. So if you have missed it, please visit our website. And yeah, let's start.
Thank you, Lieselot. Thanks so much for the welcoming words. So now let me welcome our first presenter, Lauren Tarr. She's a PhD candidate in environmental science at the State University of New York. Her studies focus on environmental justice movement, conflict collaboration, and the rights of nature. Her presentation title is Representing Rights of Nature, a reflexive thematic analysis of rights of nature websites. Thank you so much, Lauren, for being with us. And her presentation will be followed by a comment from Professor Peter Doran. So, Lauren, the floor is yours. You want to share your presentation?
Yeah, let's see. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you all for inviting me here. I'm so excited to learn from you all, and I love the international component of all of this. So my name's Lauren. I'm at State University of New York, and as Stella said, my paper topic is a reflexive thematic analysis of rights of nature websites. So a little background on how I got focused in on this topic is my background's in environmental policy and environmental studies. And I'm interested in, well, I've been frustrated with environmental laws in the US and the anthropocentric norms of them. And I was introduced to the rights of nature movement in 2020 and was very inspired by this new direction that environmental law is moving towards. So I got involved with the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature Youth Hub last year and have been sort of doing a digital ethnography of the social movement and the organizing around the rights of nature movement. And all of this background is important because part of my research process is this reflexivity of recognizing my own positionality in the study. So with ethnographic studies, my influence in how I'm understanding the movement kind of plays a part. So that kind of is my background into it. A quick overview with rights of nature that I'm sure that the next panelists will go into more too, is the idea that it is grounded in indigenous knowledges. So this ecocentric respect for nature, recognizing nature and more than human beings as subjects with their own intrinsic values. And that's sort of in opposition to a lot of our dominant environmental laws that are more anthropocentric, that focus in on humans and treat nature as property or nature as objects or resources for us to consume. And so the rights of nature movement comes in as part of this earth jurisprudence change, where we are trying to look at nature as beings worth respect on their own, as opposed to what is their relationship for our use. So the first rights of nature law passed in 2006 as a local ordinance here in the US. And since then, there've been over 140 rights of nature legal provisions passed around the world in the last 15 years. And those vary from the local ordinances that you see in the US, which tend to stay small and don't quite, they don't quite make it at the state level or the national level. But in other countries, it has had more significant impact, like it's part of the Constitution of Ecuador, or is recognized by the high courts in India. So around the world, the rights of nature movement, just in this span of 15 years, has had a lot of impacts in different ways. So I'm approaching this looking at it as a social movement, and how are people getting involved in it, and what are they learning about rights of nature as they get involved. So I framed this paper as like a first stepping stone of this broader ethnography of rights of nature as a new movement. And especially the last 2 years with the pandemic, there's a lot of virtual organizing around it, and people seek information online. So if someone goes online to learn about it, what are they going to learn? How is rights of nature being represented on these organization websites? So some of the literature that grounded me as I went through this is Website Communications for Social Movements. So Stein in 2009 kind of broke down about 6 key areas that social movement websites should hold. They should provide information, they should mobilize the audience, promote dialogue on a topic, provide lateral linkages, so connect the audience to other organizations in that topic, have an outlet for creative expression, and provide resource generation and fundraising. Another area that I looked at or had in the back of my mind as I approached this was looking at movement framing for social movements. So Snow and Benford talk about social movements as having kind of 3 key framing techniques. You have the diagnostic framing, so how do they present the problem? And then the prognostic framing, what is the solution to the problem? And then it's the motivational framing. How do you motivate your audience to take action towards that solution? And then the third set of literature I familiarized myself with is just the rights of nature literature that's been coming out in the last several years. We have books about the ethical foundations, books about the jurisprudence, what are some of the legal philosophies that connect with rights of nature, and then the politics, and how rights of nature laws changed based on location, how in different countries and in different contexts, they materialize in different ways. For my study, I decided to do 3 main rights of nature organizations. I chose ones that were over 10 years old, that had a target audience that included Americans, because as the researcher, my positionality as an American, it made sense to choose ones that I would understand the audience connection to them. Organizations that were interconnected in the RON movement. So Kaufman and Martin, in their book, they have a chapter about network analysis of the different RON organizations. And these 3 groups had a very high enmeshment and connections to other organizations. And I wanted organizations that had different angles within the movement. So some rights of nature groups focus more on indigenous rights, some focus more on community rights, some focus more on the legality and training lawyers. And so the three websites that I looked at was the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, so CELDEF. They are the oldest of the rights of nature organizations. They're the ones that passed that first ordinance here in the US in 2006. And they focus a lot on community rights along with rights of nature. The second one was the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. This is an international alliance of different member organizations and individuals who work with rights of nature. And then the third group is the Earth Law Center. So they focus on training lawyers and training the next generation of Earth Law and Earth lawyers. And both CELDEF and Earth Law Center also participate with Doran. So there are some overlaps between these groups. My method for the study was a reflexive thematic analysis. So thematic analysis means that I took all this data and I found patterns and meaning behind the patterns across the data. And the reflexive aspect foregrounds my researcher subjectivity. So me as someone who's kind of part of the rights of nature movement, situated in this American context, I recognize that I'm being trained to see the world in a certain way. And that was part of how I analyzed these websites. I took the websites and I took each page within them. I didn't use external links. So if they link to another website, I didn't go there. And I didn't look at videos, but I did the images and the text. There's over 150 pages altogether with across the three web pages. And then I coded them at a sentence level, kind of assigning a meaning to each sentence to summarize it. And then from all of those codes, I found patterns. And then from those patterns, I identified three main themes that addressed my research question. So here is the Max QDA coding software that just helps organize all of that analysis process. So after looking at those websites of those three organizations, I summarized it I found three main themes. So how is the rights of nature movement represented? It's being represented as a transformative approach, as a diverse and collaborative movement, and as a growing movement. So the first theme, rights of nature as a transformative approach. A lot of the language on these websites talk about it in very bold, paradigm shifting, very exciting words to make it sound like this is a major change, a major shift from what was happening in the past. We're doing something new. They talk about transforming your worldview, that the previous, our anthropocentric norms aren't working anymore. We are shifting towards a different way of seeing the world. It's very profound. They also tend to differentiate themselves from other organizations. Again, this sort of transformation. We're not like other environmental orgs. We're fighting for rights. We're fighting for something bold and different. And there's also an emphasis on teaching, which implies that they think the reader will be new to the topic, that because this is a transformative idea, someone who stumbles onto that website might not know what rights of nature is. So a lot of the websites have sections about, here's glossary terms, here are videos to explain it, just an emphasis on teaching. And then they also provide teaching and tutorials in schools and textbooks and training books, really to teach whoever comes to their website. So a few little excerpts from the websites. Earth Law Center talks about our mission is to transform the law to recognize and honor, protect nature's inherent rights to exist, thrive, and evolve. CELDEF differentiate themselves saying, we are not a typical environmental organization. We work to establish and protect rights, including worker and environmental rights and rights of nature. And Doran talking about breaking out of the human-centered limitations of our current legal systems by recognizing, respecting, and enforcing rights of nature is one of the most transformative and highly leveraged actions that humanity can take to create a sustainable future for all. So again, the first theme that really stood out was this old paradigm shift language. The second theme was focusing on how rights of nature movement is diverse and collaborative, that these organizations are part of a collective movement, that they're not operating alone, but they're networking with all these other groups and individuals. They also talk about being aligned with other rights movements. They all mention human rights alongside rights of nature. And they network with people from different backgrounds. There's one from CELDEF talking about it being a decolonial movement. So it's not just an environmental movement, it's also decolonizing. And it is establishing rights for humans and nature. Garn's website describes the members as a diverse network of scientists, attorneys, economists, indigenous leaders, authors, spiritual leaders, business leaders, politicians, actors, homemakers, students, activists. It's a very broad group, letting the reader know that everyone has a place in this movement. We include everybody. And the Earth Law Center, this is from a page where they're talking about orcas in particular, but they talk about their mission for that being a broad coalition, having community groups, indigenous people, scientists, lawyers, and NGOs working together. And then the third theme is that RAN is a growing movement. It highlights the growth of legal victories over time and enthusiastically encourages members to join. So the legal victories over time, all three of the websites have a timeline for rights of nature. Where they start with, all of them start by acknowledging the indigenous roots of the concept. And then some of them start with 1970, Christopher Stone's book. Others start with 2006, the first law. But then from there, you see this exponential growth of every year. There's 10, and then there's 20, and then there's more and more laws every year. And it gives the reader this sense of a lot of legal victories, that it is snowballing and growing enthusiastically. They tend not to show the challenges or the places where it failed or they tried and failed, but just this growth of successes and enthusiastic encouraging members to join. So here's the Garn website. They have a map of all the places that rights of nature is taking place. This image isn't animated, but when you go to the website, those numbers are animated. So it looks like you're starting at 0 members and you watch it rapidly climb to 1,400. Here's from Earth Law Center talking about movement building. And here's CELDEF with their rights of nature timeline. So again, just kind of recap those themes. That RAN is transformative, so paradigm shift differentiated from other organizations, and emphasis on education. Second theme was that it's diverse and collaborative, RAN is addressing multiple rights issues, and that it networks across other socio-environmental activists and groups. And the third theme, that it is a growing movement. So these laws are increasing over time, and that the membership is increasing. So to me, those themes, if the reader's coming in and that's what they get, that's what they learn about rights of nature when they look at this website, to me, that's telling me that these organizations believe that they are in a movement moment, and also that they're practicing a prefigurative politics. So these are both theories within social movement literature that describe the place of a movement and how they conceptualize themselves. So the movement moment concept comes from Masters and Osborne, 2003. Benchmarks of this, so movement moment for them is the third stage of a movement. So the first is kind of getting the ideas. The second stage is establishing an infrastructure. And then the third stage is when you have this infrastructure and now you're ready to jumpstart yourself and get more people involved. So movement moment benchmarks include major policy initiatives, sharing resources among movement organizations, increasing public support, recognition of movement leaders by political institutions, and rapidly increasing recruitment. So I saw elements of all of these within those websites. They really present themselves as if they're in this moment. Another way to describe this, D'Amelio calls it the leaping stage of a social movement, that movements have creeping stages where they're just establishing their organization. And then the leaping stage is that they are ready for public engagement. They are ready to invite people to join them to make rapid policy change. The second social theory that I felt presenting itself from these themes is the idea of prefigurative politics. So this term came from Karl Boggs in 1977. He wrote it while talking about Marxism. But essentially what it is this idea of you have this goal in the future, and instead of waiting for society to catch up to meet that goal, you just live it and enact it today. So it's similar to the Gandhi quote of be the change you want to see in the world. I like the way Mackelberg summarized it here. Practicing prefigurative politics means removing the temporal distinction between the struggle in the present and the goal in the future. Instead, the struggle and the goal, real and the ideal, become one in the present. So I saw this in a few ways. One, just the way that the Rights of Nature movement is creating the laws. Even though the norm is still anthropocentrism socially, they're still creating these ecocentric laws and trying to make the change at the same time as the laws are being enacted. And then the second way I sort of see it is in terms of the movement building and talking about how interconnected they are and how many people are joining it, kind of creating that reality by talking about that reality. So yeah, by creating the laws and reality they believe in, highlighting the movement's successes, emphasizing the growing membership. So if you are a reader, so again, my research question is, what will a reader take away from these websites? They will believe that the future is now and that the movement is taking off and that it is time for them to join. What is not emphasized on the websites is that relative to other environmental groups, rights of nature organizations, they still have a small following. So if you were to look at like CELDF, GARN, and ELC, with their Facebook followers, you could add them all up together, and it's maybe 10,000, 15,000, compared to Greenpeace has 3 million, or PETA has 5 million. So relative to other groups, it's still a pretty small social media following. And I know there's other ways to measure followings, but so just it's a different type of movement following versus the language that they're talking as if they do have abundant support. And then also not emphasized on the websites is the challenges and the unsuccessful attempts and the battles along the way. So in conclusion, how is rights of nature represented? Represented as being transformative, diverse and collaborative, and growing. These themes help to demonstrate that RON organizations are practicing a powerful prefigurative politics, creating the world they wish to live in, bringing a significant paradigm shift into reality, and asking everyone to join them. So for me, my next steps are to continue to build on this as a digital ethnography of RON as a social movement. And if any of you are interested in that type of research, I'd be happy to collaborate on anything. So there's my email down there. And thank you all again for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing your fascinating research with us. I will now hand it over to Professor Peter Doran. He has worked as a consultant writer with the UN Climate Change Convention, going back to the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol, and has written on the topics of climate change, mindfulness, environmental governance and activism on the island of Ireland, rights of nature, including a recent book on the mindful commons and the attention economy. And he has worked in NGOs and in parliamentary settings on both sides of the border and at the United Nations. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stella, and thank you and congratulations on a very stimulating paper and presentation, Lauren. Like yourself, I suppose I would describe myself as an academic activist. So I'm constantly moving between conversations with rights of nature and other environmental activists and the academy. So I thought you did a wonderful job, and I think you're a great example of unapologetically using your own positionality to reflect critically and very, very creatively on the state of the movement. I find one of the things that I found was that your conclusions spoke to my own experience. They often addressed questions that occur for me when I think about the state of the movement, the claims that the movement makes for itself. And I think that's the interesting piece here, that you're, I think by using the websites, you have captured what I would describe as a kind of a 3D snapshot of how the movement or parts of the movement are self-consciously establishing a narrative about the movement, about the impact of the movement and membership and their objectives. But in doing that, you've also highlighted some of the pitfalls, and there are some interesting observations. You've correctly identified the focus, for example, on the number of activists who are pursuing this virtually. You know, the parts of the rights of nature movement, I think, have flourished during the pandemic, and they're possibly compensating for some of the conditions that we find ourselves in. You know, the conditions of isolation and maybe a little bit separate or cut off from our social ties. So the rights of nature discourse offers potentially virtual activists a kind of ontic investment, which counters some of the conditions that we're all enduring now during the pandemic. The excess screen time, maybe, and too many hours behind the desk. I was particularly taken with your observations around the prefigurative. This reminded me of Václav Havel, the former Czech president, who also wrote about anticipatory politics in the context of the communist regimes in Czechoslovakia and other Eastern European countries. And he talked about living your truth and anticipating the truth as part of the transformational strategy that anticipated, in his case, the end of the communist regimes. In your observations and in your analysis, I think the notion of the prefigurative is a very good way to problematize some of the positions that are adopted by the activists. It's clear, and I think there are tensions within the movement, especially when the aspirations of indigenous communities and holders of local knowledge, when those aspirations are transferred to a territory like the United States or Europe. The prefigurative notion offers an interesting way to interrogate the extent to which there is possibly an ontic investment, but one that is dislocated from a sense of agency and the wider power structures that must be challenged as part of the transformation that is sought by advocates of the rights of nature. So there are perhaps blind spots in terms of analysis, blind spots in terms of agency, and perhaps an overstatement of the progress of the movement in territories where the capitalist power structures are alive and kicking, and may well tolerate a rather dislocated narrative around the rights of nature insofar as they do not adequately incorporate or embody a decolonial positionality. But I think you've touched on so much there, and there'll be lots for you to develop. Yeah, what interested me was the way in which you have begun to interrogate the self-conscious assertion of the narrative, the narrativization of the movement. And I think the questions you are asking are very much core questions within societies that are much more embedded within capitalist modernity. Just to give an example, just in the past 48 hours, a local authority in Donegal in Ireland has adopted an 18-month program to look at the adoption of the rights of nature. There's been a lot of activism, most of it online, by the way, but some engagement with politicians. And I had a discussion just within the last 48 hours with a very experienced environmental activist. And I was talking about jointly writing an opinion piece just to draw attention to this, what on the face of it looks like quite a radical and certainly an unprecedented decision by the local authority. But she was much more guarded and cautious, and warned that we need to be very careful about making claims for significance that are not justifiable, and that it's quite possible, given our structures of power, that these motions and developments within our existing power structures are more like an attempt at virtue signaling rather than a real sign of change. But you've addressed all of that, I think, and congratulations again on an excellent paper. I look forward to reading more of your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And that's both reassuring and kind of a bummer to hear that you also feel that disconnect between the statements of success versus what's actually happening on the ground. But I'm glad that, yeah, thank you. I took a lot of notes as you're talking. That helps me think through it. I appreciate your comments there.
Yes, Lauren, you can keep talking. The floor is yours. We have 5 minutes.
Okay, sorry, I jumped in. I wasn't sure.
That's perfectly fine. Go ahead. Stay with the flow.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that's one of a couple of those tensions were what I was holding on to as I approach this. One, the disconnect between the energy of people who are activists in the movement who feel very confident that it's making changes, and then especially in the US context where I just don't see the successes. And I worry in some situations that it's over-promising some of the local communities that this will give them success when really it could give them decades of costly legal battles as it fails at the state level. So trying to manage that prefigurative politics of wanting people to join the movement, wanting to create this reality, but also being honest about that it doesn't always happen overnight, and it will be, especially as you were saying, like in these more capitalist dominated countries, it will be very difficult to make those changes and those power changes. So yeah, that's something I'll definitely keep as I move next. Some of my next steps will be interviewing activists and seeing how they reflect on those tensions too, as opposed to just what the websites say in the static sense. And then the other piece that I took from your notes or from your talk is the pandemic, the past 2 years of people being disconnected and turning to virtual activism. And for me, wondering what that means for rights of nature is such a place-based thing and dependent on people caring about nature and the outdoors. But most of our organizing is on these computers and talking to very disconnected from the natural space. And what does that mean as are we creating this reality without living in it, or like this virtual imagination that makes us feel good as opposed to enacting it in our daily life or something? That's another idea I'll continue to play with, and how the pandemic inspired more people to think imaginatively too. And will we shift these virtual organizing spaces to more on the ground local organizing?
Yes, if I want, can I come in again, Stella? These observations are not
Yes,
by any means a dismissal of the movement, and I'm sure Lauren would agree with that. I think, as I say, it really is a snapshot in time of the movement at a very particular moment, a movement moment, and there will be areas of naivety. There will be moments when there is an overstatement and overpromising. And these tensions, by the way, between what is possible and what has been promised is also priced in to some of the expectations of the movements that or the organizations you're talking about, because in some cases there's an expectation that communities will test these ideas in their local authorities or local states, and they will find the ideas or the promises of their local politicians wanting. And that's priced in. There's an expectation of that. So it's a struggle to dramatize the shortcomings of the meta system, but sometimes at the expense of those frustrations of local communities who are very interested, of course, often in very localized struggles around extractivism. And this movement might not deliver soon or as ambitiously as it might be expected at this particular moment in the development of the movement. Okay, Stella?
yes, Lauren, do you want to add a last word to that?
No, just thank you, and that makes sense. These small battles versus the bigger mission, and recognizing that some of the small ones might not get the rewards that they thought they would on the individual level, but it is all adding up to this broader movement.
Yeah, thanks so much to the both of you. A really insightful presentation and conversation afterwards. I really enjoyed how it flowed between you. It was very interesting. Now we can see if there's any questions from the audience. Feel free to post it in the Q&A chat. We can wait for a second because we're actually ahead of time. So take your time to...
I have a question, Stella.
Yes, Digno, go ahead.
Great. First of all, congratulations, Laura, for such an amazing presentation. And I have a question. When I see what you found, I think that very clear of what is the essence of what is presented as the essence of the movement, that they are talking most of the time in terms of a universal movement, let's say, or a planetary movement, you know, like has having the same meanings or the same concepts. So, but what I have found is that the way how the people think the nature or the rights is different around the world. And they are talking most of the times about different natures, and also because of that about different rights. So my question is, what is the space of for the diversity or the difference that you have found within these web pages or these movements?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I noticed there isn't the ones that I looked at were American based, so maybe they didn't take the time to explain some of the different location-based perspectives, but well, I guess Garn isn't location-based, that's universal. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there wasn't an in-depth detail on those differences. And even like within CELDEF, they would talk about join the movement, and it was unclear if they're talking about their community rights movement, which they talk a lot about, versus the rights of nature movement. And they'd kind of use the term interchangeably. So someone that goes to the website interested in rights of nature and would get involved in their organization might actually be getting involved in the community rights movement more so than rights of nature. So and not knowing that there are these like different specializations and different views of what is nature and what are the rights, you wouldn't really walk away with that just looking at the websites.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to the both of you for such an engaging session. That said, I think we can move to the second session. Happy to introduce to you Juan Samper. Juan is a Colombian lawyer from the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana. He obtained a master's degree in environmental studies from Lund University in Sweden. And next month, he will be beginning his doctoral research at Lund, where he will continue the research on socio-ecological justice in the Putumayo in Colombia. And the title of his presentation is Memory and Territory, Social Leadership and the Defense of the Territory in the Putumayo. His presentation will be commented upon by Catalina Andrew Botero. Juan, the floor is yours.
All right. Yes. Super. Let me just attempt to share the screen. Can you?
Yes.
Can you see? Yeah. Super.
Perfectly.
Excellent. Yeah. So, as you can see, the name of my presentation is Memory and Territory, Social Leadership and the Defense of the Territory in the Putumayo. And well, to be honest, my perspective about the presentation has changed rather recently, since I very recently got accepted to this doctoral project in which I will be doing pretty much the same thing that I was doing in my master's degree, but at a much deeper and more expanded level. I sort of like, I don't know, my perspective changed. So with the PhD in mind, maybe rather than presenting my master's thesis, that's what I had planned to do, I will probably present in a more forward-looking kind of manner, and what yeah, just in a more forward-looking kind of manner. I don't know how to put the full screen, unfortunately, but I hope it's all right. Like it shouldn't make a big difference, I hope. Anyway, so yeah, maybe the presentation will be a little bit shorter than expected, but I hope that it will be provocative enough for a discussion and a nice Q&A session, I hope. So here's a little bit of a brief outline of what I hope to cover in the presentation. I will begin with a very short contextualization and try to problematize the very thing that summons us today, which is nature and its rights. And then I will give a presentation of some of the findings of my master's research, focused on the two main topics, which is memory and territory. And then I will give some concluding remarks and try to bring sort of like everything back to the realm of nature and its rights, and hopefully maybe ask a few questions that, I don't know, maybe will inspire a discussion or might inspire a comment or anything from the audience. So yeah, to get into like the whole thing about the nature and its rights, yesterday's presentations really got me thinking. I was very excited about them, and I watched them, and I was just first to get like an idea about what I should be talking about, but also just to get an, maybe a bigger insight in the words of from the words of the people involved in the Rivers project. And yeah, I realized that I guess that I have two very big overarching questions. One of them is one is on the realm of conceptualization of nature and the conceptualization of the rights of nature, and the other one comes in the realm of like subjectivity. So yeah, I guess the difficulty in conceptualizing nature is because it's very hard to answer the question, what is nature? Or the opposite, what is not nature, is also super hard to answer. So at least personally, I find it super difficult. and therefore the idea of it having subjectivity to me is a little bit, even I guess, a bit tougher to process. It makes me wonder what kind of subjectivity. For example, in yesterday's second presentation, we saw some parts of nature have received some like legal or juridical subjectivity, and it got me thinking about the relationship between juridical and political subjectivity, whether juridical subjectivity can exist without political subjectivity, and and then from there it's like very easy to make questions like when assigning rights to nature, who defines what nature is, what kinds of rights nature has, what kinds of actions and inactions would be considered a vulneration to the rights of nature, and what subjects can be fined, punished, and condemned by violating a right of nature. So when we suddenly, I don't know, by wondering about these things, I started really seeing that this whole concept of nature and its rights could be really problematized, in the sense that that the power relations that I guess are present and are quite ubiquitous in society could be just reproduced and could be further tightened as concepts like the rights of nature move forward. Anyway, moving to my thesis. I will start with collective memory, and to tell you a bit about collective memory in the Putumayo. And basically, it is a story of domination and resistance in many ways. In the Putumayo, there have been rebellions of indigenous peoples that are been recorded from centuries ago. They took place against religious missions in colonial times, but they also took place in the 20th century against the slavery and the genocide perpetrated by the Casa Arana and the Robber Crusade. But there is also a record of union movements since the 1960s, particularly. That's around the time when the oil and mineral extractivist projects began in the Putumayo. Then most notably, we have the Campesino Mobilization in the mid-1990s, and this is in the aftermath of the constitutional change of 1991. And it is crucial because it was I would say, a turning point in terms of political subjectivity in the Putumayo, when the campesinos particularly came up as a political subject that was independent from the armed conflict. And this is, I think this is super important in a country like Colombia, to have like some distinction about the political subjectivities that are associated to the conflict and the political subjectivities that are independent and would exist without the conflict, but in a way are victimized or re-victimized because of the dynamics of conflict. But anyway, even with the setbacks of the turn of the millennium, when the conflict created a most brutal system of domination in the Putumayo, and local communities became burdened by layers of stigma, with the peace agreement in 2016, we have an emergence. And this emergence is an emergence from a silence that had been imposed during the armed conflict. In the turn of the millennium, the armed conflict became brutal in many ways. And so social leaders, I found, can articulate this history and it's a history that has survived mainly by oral tradition. In the Putumayo, there are very few institutions that write the collective memory of the territory. In fact, it's possible to say that maybe the collective memory of the Putumayo, if it is written from the centralist perspective in the National Center of Historic Memory, but there are very few institutions in the place that will write the memory. And so this collective memory is passed on mostly oral tradition, and social leaders are very eloquent, and they can really articulate this history. And it is for this reason that in my thesis, I interpret the elimination and the violence of social leaders as the production of oblivion. Then moving on, like from the historical part and moving into the material part of my thesis, I would like to focus on the conceptions of territory. And then I will sort of like maybe begin with the conceptions of territory to then move on to what the defense of the territory, or like the context in which the defense of the territory sort of like arises, both as a discourse but also as a practice, and that's a place-based form of collective action. So narratives, as you know, a bunch of social science has already established, are so important to how we relate to certain things. In this case, the narratives about the Putumayo as a territory are key and affect the very way we relate to this place and how we understand this place. So I would like to present two very dominant narratives that exist about the Putumayo. And the first one, I take this from a quote from another researcher from the United States, who's called Christina Van Dexter, and she talks about this wild no man's land governed by the laws of the jungle, and that narrative is a very common narrative to talk about, particularly Amazonic regions in Colombia. It is common to hear people talk about it this way, and I guess that this depiction, if we want to put it like to historicize it a little bit, could come from Hardenberg's report in year 1909 that is called The Devil's Paradise. And this, even though this report had a very big influence, because it was perhaps the very first time that the atrocities of the Robber Crusade were published, what I argue is that perhaps this narrative also justifies political relations that are colonial or post-colonial in nature. So they kind of justify an objectification of the Putumayo in a way, converting it into a wild object to be developed, and mainly through the extraction of its resources, while at the same time invisibilizing the local communities in this inhabiting this territory. Yet another dominant narrative of the Putumayo comes from its depiction as a strategic corridor, and this is what I personally call the narco-bellic narrative. And for those who cannot place the Putumayo on a map, the Putumayo is located in the southwestern Colombian border, where it shares frontiers with Ecuador and Peru, and it is also a part where the Amazon rainforest and the Andes mountains meet. So these factors make the Putumayo incredibly fertile for plantation, including that of coca, and marginal enough for the processing of cocaine and its transport out of the country. So it is no surprise that there is conflict over this territory, both between armed groups involved in narco-trafficking and between them and the Colombian armed forces. And this conception of the territory as a strategic corridor has also legitimized military intervention that, at best, invisibilizes communities, and at worst, it visibilizes them, but through layers of stigma that are created by the prejudices associated to the armed conflict. And these prejudices are layers of stigma, such as that they are collaborators of a guerrilla, or that they are collaborators of a paramilitary group, or that they are informants of the Colombian army, and those layers of stigma really create a situation in which armed groups not only conceive the territory in a manner that its people are perhaps unimportant, but also it fosters the perfect environment for a brutal system of domination through the silencing of communities. So in this context, the defense of the territory arises as I would say, maybe a subaltern, decolonial, place-based narrative that comes from the very inhabitants of the territory and includes the diverse cultural associations that different ethnic groups in the Putumayo have with the place that they inhabit and their environment. And in this sense, I found that social leaders are also crucial in the articulation of these narratives and in leading the practices of defending the territory. And these practices are denouncing the violations of human rights committed by armed actors. And when we talk about armed actors in the context of Colombia, we are including not only guerrillas, paramilitary or narco-trafficking gangs, but we are also including the Colombian armed forces, its military and its police. And also denouncing the illegal extractivist incursions into the territory by mining companies that are either illegal or that are maybe stepping on top of existing regulations and existing prohibitions. Like, for example, it's occurring right now where there is a Canadian copper company in Mocoa, the capital city of the Putumayo. They're opening a copper mine, and in the municipality of Putumayo, there has been for a long time, since 2017, been declared that the extraction and mining in the Mocoa River is forbidden. So this is the kind of practices that would be associated to the defense of the territory. And for this reason, it is that I argue that silencing of social leaders, aside from being the production of oblivion, is also the production of detachment. And this, in other words, is the uprooting of communities from the places that they inhabit. So as a manner of conclusion, and I'm realizing that I'm first speaking super fast, and second, the presentation has been a little bit shorter than I expected. I would like to maybe put forth perhaps the strongest argument in my thesis, that is that oblivious and detached communities have no struggle, they have no history, and they have no place. And in a very disturbingly real way, to quote Gabriel Garcia Marquez' famous ending of 100 Years of Solitude, they do not have a second opportunity on earth. So this I understand as a quintessential form of political violence, as places with no history, places that are not territories, are empty, are exploitable, are colonizable, and are the basis of narratives that legitimize the imposition of and reproduction of many systems of domination that are the very essence of the resistance that is at the heart of the defense of the territory. So, that was a very big synthesis of my thesis. And now wishing to bring the presentation back to its context here in our webinar about nature and its rights. How does this play out when discussing this topic? And there's a very short answer, and the short answer is that I don't know. But however, I would like to pose some questions that could perhaps help us further understand the connections between the defense of the territory as this form of collective action that is both historically contingent but also geographically bound to a specific place, and the idea of nature and its rights. So as you can see in the final slide, I posted some questions. What is the relationship between collective memory and nature? And what is the relationship between territory, place, and nature? Are territorial rights a kind of rights of nature? If we were to argue that territory is a concept that includes both environment and culture, that includes both nature and culture, people and their environment, then would territorial rights be a kind of rights of nature? Moving a little bit beyond what rights of nature already exist independently of the legal subjectivity of ecosystems or other parts of nature. And here I'm talking about what kinds of rights of nature already exist in, let's just say, talking from a more anthropological conception of the law, not the very narrow conception of law that us lawyers tend to have sometimes, but on a more open, broadly, let's just say, sociological or anthropological conception of the law. And then, to what extent are these rights of nature being already exercised through collective struggles, such as the defense of the territory? These are all questions that I hope that, I don't know, maybe will get you thinking, or maybe or something. Yeah. Well, anyway, this is where I also hope that these questions might help me with my own doctoral project, as I will just be starting it next month, and I hope that maybe I can also keep in touch with the project, with the Rivers projects, and with us researchers here, and maybe keep thinking and maybe see how we can also collaborate in ways that perhaps we are still not aware of. And well, that being said, thank you very much. Sorry that maybe the presentation was a little bit too short. And if you are interested in my thesis, it is published in the Lund University library, but I will put the link to the thesis in the chat in case anyone wants to sort of like dive deeper into this topic. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Juan. Yes, please do share your thesis link in the chat. Thanks for your super dense presentation. No worries at all that it was shorter than you thought. I think there's plenty of thought provocation going on, so we have lots of time to discuss. I think I learned a lot, and yeah, I'm happy to present Catalina now. Catalina Andrew Botero is a postdoctoral researcher of the Rivers ERC project. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, and a degree in law and anthropology from the same university. Her academic interests are orientated around the study of intersection between science, law, and anthropology. And her research experience addresses the role of science and natural scientists in the peace process with the FARC in Colombia. She's currently developing work on interlegal translation in the courts, a line of research in which she questions the role of anthropological expertise in water litigation. Thanks for being with us, Caro. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stella, for that introduction. And Juan Antonio, it's very nice to meet you, at least virtually. I got the opportunity to read your thesis, so my comments will develop specifically on your thesis, and that will relate to your presentation as well. So first of all, you start your thesis with a proposition on how to bring together two conceptual worlds, one from the political ecology, and how to use political ecology to study social movements. And I think that's very interesting relation you're bringing there, since we do have a lack of political ecology studies in studying specifically social movements, and more specifically transitional justice and violence in Colombia, and the peace process more specifically. And one of your propositions is to use these powered relations, to understand these powered relations and how they control the environment. And with that said, I was very interested on how you were going to develop these ideas through your thesis, because I think it's a very interesting conceptual proposition that you're doing there. So with the defending the territory, which is basically the line of your argumentation, I would love if you could expand on what that defense means, specifically since in some vignettes in your thesis we can see that there's a tension between Inga communities that you were studying and peasant communities, and I think that tension in itself plays a very interesting and a very important role on how territory is defended not only from extractive companies, or from the state, and from this idea of the wild non-occupied territories, but as well from people inside the territory and from other communities inhabiting the territory. So I will add that other scale of analysis. I think it would be very interesting if you could problematize that very interesting tension you point out, because that's very constitutive of what Putumayo is, and how relations are played. And this said about power relations and control over the environment. In a place in your thesis, you also mentioned, but very quickly, and I would love if you could go deeper into that, how these peasant communities used conservation strategies, environmental conservation strategies, to create certain ideas of territories, which I think it plays more. It plays. It's more related to what you were saying about using political ecology to study social movements. So maybe if you can go deeper into these strategies about conservation and how is a territory being produced. And I think there's one question which I had and I'm gonna reiterate the question, is defending the territory from whom? And the other is the definition of territory. And if we take this into account, we'll see that the definition of territory, at least as it appears, it appears static. And I believe that from how all these tensions play out, it's something that it's constantly reinventing, redefining, retelling, redoing, everything. So and this will go in hand with one of the questions you were bringing to the end about the rights of nature, and specifically how the decision on the Amazon as a subject of rights touches this specific context and these communities, and how they play arguments for defending the territory as well. So I believe the decision on the Amazon as a subject of rights can start playing a role here on what territory is. But this on the one hand, but as well from your thesis, I got this idea that there's a fixation of practices into the land in order to define territory. And with this, I mean, you like in a place in your thesis, you talk about documenting violent practices. And it's like, I had two questions regarding that. How are practices being documented? By whom? And how that documentation of violent practices produces a specific way of territory, and if it's also a political strategy to locate these practices in order to define territorial or ownership, since you were talking about the predominance of legalization and formalization of land tenure, and I was wondering if that has a role, something to do, as well as the conservation strategies. So conservation strategies, in some sort of way, it fixes and it fixates, it locates, it tries to place some practices into the land in order to produce a specific sense of territory. So what is very interesting being played out here is that there's a tension or territories being co-produced by fixation of practices, but as well by redoing and a process that is ongoing and new things are going on. So so I would encourage you to think in that in those two ways always, like to keep in mind that a project of fixation may occur in relationship to a project that is ongoing. So one of your definitions about territory is territory as what has been dispossessed, and you talk about this rupture about culture and nature. However, through these practices that we just talked about before, I was wondering if there's a reinstating culture as well. Like there's rupture, but then there's a process of redoing some cultural practices, or in some sort of way, like activating other type of practices in order to I think rupture can be productive in many ways. It can be dispossession, but it can be repossession. So I wonder if a sort of repossessioning takes place here, and all these plays with your question about what territory is. Like all these questions I am posing are related to this idea of what territory is and how is territory being practiced and talked about and done. And I would like to encourage you as well to go further into the ethnographic details. I know that you have your quotes to your field notes, but I would love to see them in your text, since it would be easier and to understand some of the concepts you use in the text. For example, pedagogical resistances, to talk about the social movements, and it would be awesome if you can show us what those pedagogical resistances are about, maybe from one of your experiences, that you can tell us how that plays out, not only producing the social movement, but how territory is done through these pedagogical resistances, and specifically on the way you describe social leader to be, since one of your main arguments and very interesting and important arguments is the role of social leaders. I believe these ethnographic vignettes can help us understand more closely how social leaders relate to these instances specifically, and through pedagogical resistances. I believe it's one of the ways we can illuminate this. And about the recognition of the social leaders. You talked about it in your presentation. Maybe I think it wasn't very clear in your thesis about the role of drug dealing in all this context, and especially for social leaders, because I believe there's like through drug and through arguments of drug dealing specifically, you can try to make invisible or not recognize social leaders. And that's one of your quotes on page 23, that they said we're people, we're not dogs. I believe it says. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't remember clearly. So it seems as if the argument about drug dealing was being used, and I'm not sure, and this is a question, was being used to invisibilize these people from being legitimate and for having the authority to be social leaders. Because it seemed to me as if by an association to drugs and to drug dealing and drug cultivation and so harvesting and like to the economy of drug, they were removed from their capacity to speak on behalf and to be portrayed as social leaders, and especially in relation to the national government and the institutions. I believe that argument can be played out in order to not recognize this relation to the territory and not recognize their validity of what they are, what they can say and represent. Okay, and I believe I just said too many things about your thesis. I'm so sorry. You must be all over the place with my comments, but I would love if we can later discuss about your project, and with more time we can go through all the ideas and through the reading. And again, congratulations on your PhD project, and it would be delightful to see how it advances and your new discoveries while you do your doctoral thesis.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I think that I can start. So like talking, I ended up writing like maybe 11 points. So I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to cover them all, but let's go one by one. So you wanted me first to maybe expand a little bit about the defense of the territory in terms of scale, and with focus on the tension that exists between the Bloque San Juan campesinos and the Inga community. And this is in the municipality of Villagarzón in Putumayo, which are very close to Mocoa. The only way, well, one of the easiest ways to get into the Putumayo is flying, and you fly into Villagarzón. So Villagarzón is a rather big municipality, and it is right in the intersection between the Amazon and the Andes. Like part of it is flat and part of it is rising up into the mountains, and that makes it super, like both, like it makes it ecologically beautiful, but it also has made it like the scene of a lot, because there's military bases, there's police bases, there is a lot of coca growing as well, and so there a lot has sort of like conflated in this municipality. And the thing is that one of the things that got put on top was the constitution of a resguardo indígena. And then for the people that do not know finesse of Colombian law, an indigenous resguardo is a constitutional collective land title that is given to indigenous peoples. This is a very simple explanation of what a resguardo is, but just so like to maybe so like balance the waters a little bit, it's a collective land title, and it was delimited inside the municipality of Villagarzón. And it so happened that the Bloque San Juan communities that are like 18 or 19 communities, all of them are campesinos, except maybe 18 campesino communities and then 1 or 2 indigenous communities, all of them sort of like in a state, like they are either them or their parents were displaced and ended up in this part of the country. And and so they are battling, or basically they don't agree with the indigenous resguardo. They say that that's not Inga territory anymore, and the tension is very physical. They have not let the Inga community into the territory, so they have even exercised enough territorial control to not let them in. And this is not the whole resguardo; it's just a portion of the resguardo. It's a very it's just a portion of it. So the idea of defending the territory here finds, and that's a little bit that's a bit like what I got into the thesis, is that when you look at it at scale, the defense of the territory can definitely be used as an argument and as a practice of resistance against another group that is not necessarily the state, or not necessarily an armed actor in the conflict, but another, you could say, subaltern group of the Putumayo, and it creates ethnic tensions. And this is perhaps one example of many, that I'm sure there's many more that exist in the Putumayo. This was just the one that I happened to know about. So yeah, and they are doing the legal battle right now, trying to sort of like fix the declaration of the resguardo. And I never got into like the very legal side of it, so I wouldn't be able to give an opinion as to whether they are wasting their time or not. But resguardos indígenas are heavily protected, and it's very, I would, from my like standard knowledge, I would say that it's highly unlikely that it will ever change. But at the same time, it is worth questioning the methodologies and the implications of creating a resguardo indígena where there's other people sort of like inhabiting there. But at a larger scale, the defense of the territory, while also has like, I talk about it in terms of strategic alliance, and it's also at the defense of the territory in its discursive form, does allow for this sort of strategic alliance that sort of many different communities will find a common struggle, while they do recognize that on the ground and in material life, there are tensions between them. But sort of like maybe kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. So they do find a common struggle against, I guess, larger projects, larger incursions into the territory. And so, yeah, there is definitely a scalar issue to it. And I really hope I can get into deeper detail in the PhD. I think the crucial difference between my master's thesis and the doctoral project will be that I am a lot more interested in theory of territory and scale. So there will be a lot more geography, there will be a lot more legal geography, and there will definitely be a stronger, I hope at least, a stronger focus on the scalar issues of defending the territory. And so I'll move on to the second point, which was how are environmental conservation strategies used to construct or produce territory. And this was super interesting, because another thing that I found that I found or that I was told, or that I found, is that coming back to this tension between the Inga community and the Bloque San Juan communities, they were super skeptical of each other's sort of like conservation arguments. And the reality is that from sort of like an epistemological level, the Inga community, they prefigure a lot of environmental conservation in their own practices, in their own understanding of their environment, and in their own idea of balance. While the Bloque San Juan also, they prefigure a lot environmental conservation, and their love of their environment and the reasons why they protect the environment are, I would say, an epistemology of their own, and is that there is a love to the land and there is a history of it, because it was through work, through working the land, through sort of like creating this connection with agricultural practices and so on, that many of them say that they were able to survive the brutal domination from armed actors throughout the conflict. And it was a way of sort of like maybe accepting the frustration and all the feelings that might be associated with being put in a completely in a situation in which you're completely dominated and you have to either keep quiet or who knows what's going to happen to you. So they do have very epistemological ways in which they just their life and their living and their practices prefigure a lot of environmental conservation, and they construct the territory through a very, I would say, a very complex process here. Like I would not dare to like bring an explanation. I definitely think that they do have epistemological differences, and they are different to my own epistemology of like environmental conservation. So yeah, it's, of course, it will be a little bit difficult for me to say like, or to do any judgment, but I would definitely say that it's worth taking into account that they just understand at a very deep level of production of knowledge. They understand the environment and its conservation in a way that allows them to just protect it while living, which is in their own very ways. Moving, I think I have touched upon points 3 and 4, where defending the territory from whom and the definition of territory. I think these really, it binds to like the first point a lot. And yeah, of course, it depends on the scale. Defending the territory from whom? Well, at a one scale, it'd be between one community and other. At a larger scale, they might find a common struggle to defend it in the name of political recognition, in the name of self-determination and freedom. They will defend it against other actors as like in like a collective struggle kind of way. As to the definition of territory, to be honest, I got so many that I don't know what to say. I got so many definitions, but the thing that they had most in common is this idea that territory is a concept that includes nature and culture. So it is, regardless of like the epistemological origin of the definition, there is a conscience about the territory as this thing that binds society and environment, humans and nature. And that I thought it was very, yeah, I thought it was both deep, but it's also a concept that then is worth exploring when we're talking about environmental studies, when we're talking about conservation and development, and this idea that is environmental peace building, for example, in Colombia, that is really the territorial focus of all of this, so like grand schemes, has to allow for a definition or understanding of territory in the terms that the local communities understand territory, which I guess binds the next point, which was the fixation on the land to define territory, and how our practices of violence being documented and how they produce territory as well, and the co-production of territory. I feel like it's sort of like you took me like, I'm just realizing that you took me like jumped straight into the next point, which is this, like, I guess, yeah, the co-production of territory is a fantastic way of saying what I wanted to say like 1 minute ago. So I'm just giving me a second. I'm just gonna underline here. And yeah, I guess I'm not very familiar with the term of fixation, so I wouldn't like to like give an answer. Like, remember that I am a lawyer, so my education in social science concepts is still ongoing, but so I wouldn't know what to say about like this idea of a project of fixation. But from what like my own understanding of fixation, there is definitely a fixation on the land, like both at the way they, for example, the Bloc San Juan communities would talk about the land, or the way the Inga community would talk about the land, but also, for example, in the round table, in the Mesa Territorial de Garantías, the round table for like guarantees of non-repetition, and I don't know, it's a mouthful to translate, but they were also very focused on territorial rights, on reparation, on land distribution, on like land is very prominent. And I was reading, I think it was 2 days ago, this paper about how to understand territory. Sometimes land is it's a bidimensional concept, and they were sort of like proposing that maybe to understand territory, we should have a volumetric approach, which would be sort of like including not only the land surface, but also sort of like this volume consistent of like the underground and the air and all of what is on, like it's a three-dimensional sort of like perspective of territory that also maybe helps transcend that fixation on land, and also helps and this is like I'm speaking just from blind thoughts that I had while reading 2 days ago. Like it would be super helpful to understanding this idea of sovereignty of the underground, as sort of like producing sort of like a local state sovereignty of the underground that sort of like would legitimize forbidding the extraction of minerals that are underground or that are in the rivers. So it was a very, the fixation of land definitely has limits and has a lot of like conceptual limits. Which takes me to the next point, which was like, how does territory produce a changing culture? And I don't like how producing territory also affects how they think about it. And I think that binds to the very last point, or like not the very last point, the second to last point of like pedagogical resistance, because sort of like, by constructing the territory and starting to talk about it in a certain way and creating this narrative about it that comes from the defense of the territory, they sort of like start these kinds of projects of pedagogical resistance that in very short is a few social leaders that go to very small communities or hold workshops in their own communities with young people about how the campesino lifestyle and the indigenous practices are not something to be ashamed of, and are not you know, in themselves are not poor. Like they are, it's a very, it's just a very, very deep understanding of like their own culture. And I think it does, by producing territory and talking about the territory, they sort of like reaffirm their own commitment towards their own culture in a way that it's also in a way that also allows them to talk about it with younger people and with their sons and daughters and like the younger the generations, who are at a particular crossroads, because they're also realizing their conditions of perhaps marginalization and socioeconomic status, while they also realize the specifically economic prospects of joining a gang, a drug, or getting into the drug dealing business, be that by growing coca or by just going even deeper into the structures of narco traffic. So that's what they mean about pedagogical resistance. It's sort of like creating sort of like some sort of love towards the culture and some sort of sense of self pride, or like collective pride. It was super interesting. Unfortunately, during the field work, I wasn't able to like follow through with the social leader that talked the most about these things. I had to make a decision. I had I could have gone either to that or to something else on the very same day. The other was to get into like very deep into the Bloque San Juan territory and assist and go to a meeting between all the social leaders of the communities who were going to talk about their tension with the Ingas. So yeah, I decided to do this instead of that. So that's also like I guess just the things that happen in life. But I do have I hope that when I go back, I managed to sort of like, get these wheels sort of like rolling again and see where they go. And then, yeah, maybe I would like to, now that I mentioned ethnography, get into social leaders. and the concept of social leaders, I didn't want to dwell too much on it during the thesis because it's a very context-based thing. And a social leader is a person who is talked about as a social leader and who is accepted by their social base as a social leader. And they're not social leaders for everything. They're social leaders generally for specific things. And except like with the exception of, I would say, very well experienced leaders who are like on a larger or more sort of like, yeah, on a bigger position of leadership, but it's generally, it's not a blind sort of like recognition. It's usually for specific things. And certainly to finish on the drug dealing, that's what I mean by the layers of stigma. In the 1990s, the Campesino Mobilization, the core of that mobilization were the cocaleros, the coca growing campesinos. And they managed incredible sort of like recognition of their political subjectivity as actors that are independent from the conflict in a way. Like they are not in war with anyone. They are growing coca because it's their economic, is like their best or like most rational economic decision to make. But I would say that, in the turn of the century, politically, and not only in Colombia, but globally, the discourse of terrorism came. And with it, in Colombia, it transformed very fast into this discourse of narco-terrorism. And anyone who is involved, so it was a bit of a setback for that mobilization, that they suddenly, this layer of stigma of the narco-terrorists came. Because nowadays, even coca growers are thought about as narco-terrorists when they have for the last 20 years or 30 years almost, they have been fighting to make the state and our political institutions understand that they are one of the main victims of the conflict. Because first of all, they're in conditions of poverty and marginalization. It's not like they have that much of a choice to grow coca leaves, but also because their conditions as coca leaves growers are uncertain and are not protected precisely because of the illegal nature of the business. So you definitely will find social leaders who are in one way or another involved. They might themselves grow coca, they might have their little plot of land and grow their own coca because they also have to live and they also have to eat and they have to provide for their families because being a social leader doesn't pay. And so it's like it's of course there is a stigma and they are, and I think that's a discussion that we need to, like, almost as Colombian society, I sometimes find it incredible that we haven't sort of like finished and realized that many of the people that are involved in the drug business are not narco-terrorists. And in fact, they are the most vulnerable groups of people when we consider and we think about the conflict and we think about policies for peace and conservation in areas that were or still are in conflict. So while it might be infuriating to think that those, even though after 30 years of like a very strong movement, they still don't have the political recognition that they should be, or that they should have, there is a sector of society that is very well aware, and particularly there, very well aware that they are not actors of the conflict, but they're most, that they have a political subjectivity of their own, and that, for example, they are the beneficiaries of programs sort of like the PNIS, the substitution program, that unfortunately is a little bit underfunded, and maybe more than a little bit underfunded, but it is. So the peace agreement does sort of like bring political tools that are in line with them as subjects. Oh, I just saw Stella's message. I don't know, Stella, when you wrote 3 minutes. I'm sorry.
1 more minute.
Okay.
You can have 30 seconds to a minute to wrap it up.
Well, just to wrap it up, definitely it creates stigma and delegitimization from a sector of society, mostly the sector of society in the center of the country that is not still fully aware of the realities of many people in the more rural areas of the country and the more conflict affected areas. But I would say that in practice, in the ground, in the Putumayo, whether you are a coca grower or not, does not delegitimize you and does not create any kind of stigma against you as a social leader. That would generally come more from political institutions of the central Colombia, right? These will come from, I don't know, the district attorney's office, or very central authorities that still bind to the discourse of narcoterrorism implicitly or explicitly. Yeah, like, oof. I think I managed to sort of like touch upon most of the points, but I am down, like, yeah, we can definitely talk about more about this later, Carolina, for sure.
Thank you so much, Juan and Carolina. I see there's lots of material for conversation. Yeah, thank you, both of you, very much. It's super interesting to follow. I suggest now we take a little 10-minute break to recharge our batteries. Stay tuned for the last presentation where Julia Torres will present from New Zealand. She will introduce her to her super interesting research on the Te Urawera forest legal entity and on decolonizing relationships. So I hope to see you all there in 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We hope you can start this last session with some fresh energy. And a special welcome to Julia Torres, who got up super early for all of us. We really appreciate it. Let me just check, Julia and Jérémie, are you both back from the break?
Yes, we are here.
Wonderful.
Well, I am here.
I think so is Jérémie. I think I just saw her screen moving.
Yeah, I'm here.
Perfect. So let me introduce you to Julia Torres, who holds a bachelor's degree in law from the University of Chiapas, Mexico. And in 2010, she obtained a Fulbright scholarship to study a master's in law at American University in the United States. And currently she's living and studying a PhD at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. In her professional career, Julia has advocated for Mayan indigenous groups in the border region of Mexico and Guatemala on issues of land, natural resources, and human rights. And her academic research focuses on indigenous rights and environmental law, with special interest on comparative law in Latin America. And the title of her presentation of today is the Urawera Forest Legal Entity, Decolonizing Relationships. And her commentator is Professor Jérémie Gilbert. So the sun has set in Madrid. It's nice to see some light in New Zealand. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share screen. Can you see my screen on my presentation?
Yes, I can see it perfectly.
Thank you. Can you see the same screen or the same screen or has changed?
Still the same.
It's the same. Well, doesn't move. Sorry, some technical problems. I don't see it moving either. Yeah, can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. During the last days of November, the national news in New Zealand reported that the Great Walk Lake Waikaremoana will remain closed to the public after the COVID-19 restrictions. The Lake Waikaremoana is the jewel of the Te Urawera, and the Great Walk is a 3 to 4 days hiking track around the lake, staying in cabins, walking on the track, crossing big rivers through bridges, and enjoying the best landscapes of New Zealand. It is one of the 10 great walks that New Zealand offers to local and international tourists. When I heard the news, I was a little bit sad because I consider myself a hiker, and I was willing to do these 46 kilometers around the lake. But on the other side, I was astonished for the new administration of the Te Urawera legal entity. Good morning, everyone in Europe, and good tomorrow morning from Aotearoa, New Zealand. In the next minutes, I will present part of my PhD research about the Te Urawera forest. My research is a comparative study between the Atrato River and the Te Urawera forest, and this is just a small part of the Te Urawera forest case. Well, this is the outline. First, I will talk about the historical relationships between Maori, Touhou, and the Crown. Maori are the indigenous peoples of this country. Touhou are a tribe of Maori which are living or located in the Te Urawera forest. And by the Crown, I mean either the British government when they colonized New Zealand and the current government after their independence, especially the entities and bodies that are related to this case. Well, then I will talk about the contemporary relationships between Touhou, the forest, the Crown, and non-Touhou. It is important to clarify, though, that I'm not speaking on behalf of Maori or on behalf of Touhou. My voice is of a Latin American researcher, which is trying to find out different solutions around this area. And my interpretations are from the examination of academic literature, some legal documents, and also some interviews. Okay, before talking about the historical relationships, let me tell you where New Zealand is. Well, our closest neighbors are Australia and the Antarctic. And New Zealand is the British name of this couple of islands, which are actually 3 islands, but we also always refer to 2, in the South Pacific Ocean. The academia now is a trend, and we used to call it Aotearoa, New Zealand, because Aotearoa was the name given by Maori after colonization. Before colonization, these 2 islands didn't have a name. In 1769, Captain Cook landed in New Zealand, and the first relationships between the British and Maori were of trade and exchange. Few years later, the British settlers arrived in New Zealand to occupy the territories and exploit the resources. At the beginning of the 1800s, there were 90,000 Maori people living in New Zealand and only 2,000 settlers in the islands. Just to give you a track of the time, during this time, most of the Latin American countries were obtaining their independence. In the next 50 years, the problems arise between the British colonizers and Maori, especially for issues of land. Maori wanted to preserve the control of their lands and establish new relationships with the crown. Those were specifically the main reasons to sign the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi is an agreement between Maori and the crown that recognized 2 main things. First, that the land belonged to Maori, and second, that the land could only be sold to the crown. Probably you know that this treaty was in English and then translated into Maori, but they had 2 different versions, which caused a lot of conflicts. But that's not something I'm going to talk today. I just wanted to let you know that those are one of the main issues here in New Zealand. Well, but after the signature of the Treaty of Waitangi, the crown managed to confiscate, declare wars, force Maori to sell, and deceive them in different occasions to obtain more land. 30 years after the signature of this treaty, a court case declared the treaty a nullity, signed by primitive barbarians. And this was the law that regulated the relationships between Maori and the crown for more than 100 years. In the decade between 1970s and 80s, Maori groups started different protests. So the crown decided in 1975 to create the Waitangi Tribunal, who was going to investigate outstanding issues between Maori and the crown related to the Treaty of Waitangi. This commission of inquiry was going to work from 1975 and investigate cases from 1975 to the present. But the issues were so clear that the problems started in 1840 that the Waitangi Tribunal in 1985 decided to investigate cases back to 1840. But the history of Touhou was a little bit different from other iwis or tribes in New Zealand. Of course, it was full of confiscation, legal and illegal acquisition of land by the crown, but Touhou did not sign the Treaty of Waitangi. They didn't have the opportunity to do that. They were part of the Waitangi Tribunal because they stated that when the crown declared sovereignty over the North Island, the crown acquired responsibilities and obligations to care for Maori. Well, they filed more than 40 claims, historical claims. And one of the most important cases was the Urawera District Native Reserve Act 1896. This was a legislation in which the Crown granted Touhou self-determination of a specific native reserve. Of course, the legislation was never implemented. After 1920s, Touhou kept only 16% of their territories, and most of them were unsuitable for living or for economic development. The Crown kept carrying on with more confiscation and legal and illegal acquisition of land, and in 1954, the Crown declared the Urawera Forest a national park. And with that, the Crown displaced Touhou totally for conservation purposes. Well, the Waitangi Tribunal extended a report in 2009 and 2010. I have to say here that it was an interesting case because Touhou and the Crown both claim the ownership of the former national park. But because both of them didn't want to grant or the ownership, they broke negotiations in 2010. Fortunately, with a lot of political lobbying and good leadership, they returned to negotiations and reached a deed of settlement in 2013. The deed of settlement here in New Zealand contained an apology, cultural and financial redress, and also vested the Urawera Forest as a legal person and provided with this legislation. And it's here where we started to come to the topic. The Urawera Act is the legislation I'm talking about, and it declared the Urawera Forest as a legal entity with all the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a person. It also created the Urawera Board, which is a co-governance body with 6 representatives of Touhou and 3 representatives of the Crown, and the chair is Touhou. This board is in charge of representing the board and govern the forest and governing the forest too. And it also stated that the body, the Urawera Board, needed to create a management plan. And this management plan is called the Te Kawa o Te Urawera. Well, I finally came to the contemporary relationships between Touhou and the forest, the Crown, and non-Touhou. From this date, I will examine the relationships between Touhou, and especially when they are representing the Urawera and in a co-governance relationship with the Crown. But why to examine relationships? I'm following some of the academics who were studying the cases here in Australia and New Zealand, and specifically Macpherson states that the main contribution of the cases from New Zealand and Australia is their relationships. So I consider that the Urawera provides important insights to decolonize the relationships in co-governance arrangements. And by decolonize, I mean to change, remove traditional ways of co-governance or governance. So I argue that Touhou are using transformative measures to relate with the forest, the Crown, and non-Touhou. By transformative measures, I mean their philosophies, what they call their philosophies, and that include Touhou Tanga, concepts, values, worldviews, and customary law. And you can see here the Urawera Act 2014 in section 18.2 requests the board to consider and express these philosophies in the decision making. Well, in the next slides, you will read and hear some information about the interviews, some of the interviews I was doing. I am still in the process of collecting information from this case. But the first relationship I want to explore is between Touhou and the forest. And here Touhou expressed, or the people I interviewed expressed, that before they couldn't exercise their responsibilities as descendants of the forest. According to their philosophies, they are the youngest children of the forest, and they have obligations to care for the forest. These obligations are called kaitiaki, which I can translate it is more or less caretakers, but that's my perspective of my translation. And then the interview is manifested that they need to learn how to be kaitiakis, and they need to know who and what they are now, because after years of not relating with the forest, they are still trying to understand who they are to better understand what the forest needs. Here you can read what one of the interviews expressed concerning the relationship with the forest, while I take a sip of water. Well, the second contemporary relationship I want to talk is about Touhou and the crown. Some of the interviewees manifested that they were enemies, and suddenly, in one day, they moved to be enemies to colleagues, and now they are actual partners. Well, now that they govern together, what they say is that they need to reflect the challenges, to reflect Maori philosophies using Western systems and the law. And here they have a great opportunity because the board has a majority of Touhou, and the decision-making has to be primarily unanimous, then by majority, and last by vote. And they also have a chair, which is Touhou. Here you can also hear that they are kind of they don't trust totally on the crown, but they recognize that the crown has the resources and the ability to legislate. And these are words of Timothy Kruger, which is the chair of the board and the representative of Touhou. So I'm going to talk about some mutual obligations. In this co-governance table or board, they have mutual obligations between Touhou and the crown, which are specified in section 4 of the Urawera Act. And I will be talking one by one now. Well, the first one is to strengthen and maintain the connection between Touhou and the Urawera. Well, here the interviewers just said that the crown measures everything with numbers. But how to measure the connections between Touhou and the Urawera? Only the crown, only Touhou know. So they suggest to abandon the crown's way to measure and include Touhou philosophies. To preserve the Urawera, the interviewers manifested that they see a big gap between what the forest needs and what the crown is available to fund. For example, State Road 38 crosses the Urawera, and the crown wanted to pave it using Tarr, but Tarr was not friendly with nature, and I'm going to quote what they say. Tarr is not friendly with the forest. It is stolen from the earth using exploitative practices. Finish quotation. Touhou instead suggested to use wood sap, a kind of resin that improved the state highway and also was friendly with the nature, and so did they. And another mutual obligation is to provide for the Urawera as a public place for use and enjoyment. And here the main obligation is the safety and health of the visitors. And I come back here to what I was talking at the beginning about Great Walk Lake Waikaremoana. The interviewee said that since 2014, the Department of Conservation, which is in charge of tourism, abandoned the forest and did not maintain the cabins, the tracks, and the bridges. But the Department of Conservation was still charging and getting the fees for the tracks and offering it. As some of the interviews expressed it, the Crown did not want to give money either because they were not going to say how to use the money. Why the Great Walk Lake Waikaremoana will stay closed? Well, the good news is that they announced that it's for maintenance and also to protect the most vulnerable population from COVID restrictions, from COVID-19. The best news are that they are going to open, they announced that they will open it next year. And the last kind of relationships I promised to talk about is the Touhou and the relationships with non-Touhou. And those are the visitors and users of the forest. Visitors used to come and do whatever they wanted in the forest after they paid a fee, a royalty, or a concession. And I mean to hunt, fish, extract resources, leave their garbage, cut the trees, and do what they wanted. But the Tekawa or Urawera, the management plan, suggested to create friendly agreements instead. And a friendly agreement is a new way to relate with the forest. It's a way to relate to the forest in a respectful way, and also to understand Touhou philosophies and how Touhou has an obligation to care for the forest. Of course, there is a lot of controversies and discomfort, especially for those people who for years and generations came to the forest to do what they wanted. You can read now what they think about these friendly relationships because it's very philosophical and important. And just to wrap up, I hope you finished reading. If not, I can put it later. Well, I talked about the historical relationships between Maori, Touhou, and the Crown, because I consider very important to know that this case is not a case of the preservation of the forest. It is a case to solve historical grievances of Touhou against the Crown. And then I talked about the relationships between Touhou and the forest, the Crown, and non-Touhou after the declaration of the Urawera as a legal entity with the rights of a person. And I wrap this up just to conclude that I consider that Touhou are stepping out of the traditional colonial way to co-govern in New Zealand. They are implementing transformative measures using their philosophies to relate to the forest. Of course, there are many challenges. I just told you the most positive cases, the most positive outcomes in the practice. As a Latino American, I consider this a lot. But when we talk about the cases here, of course, many of them said there is still many more things to do. What I can say now is that I invite you to follow this case attentively in the future because it's a very interesting case. Tēnā koutou, thank you, gracias. Some bibliography over there.
Thank you so much, Julia. I will hand it over to Jérémie Gilbert, who is a professor of human rights law at Roehampton University. His main area of research is international human rights law, and more particularly the relationship between human rights law, natural resources, and environmental issues. His work particularly focuses on supporting the rights of indigenous peoples and nomadic communities to land and natural resources. We're looking forward to your comments.
Hey, Julia, good to meet you. And thanks for
Nice to
waking up
meet you.
early. Hello, everybody as well. I've got very short comment, Julia, because your work is very comprehensive. So just have to say congratulations and keep going. I have 3 comments. The first one, I'm going to be provocative on purpose. I actually don't believe what I'm going to say, but I need to do it. The last time I went to Australia and I met some Aboriginal people, they stopped me straight away, like, Jérémie, stop your nonsense on right of nature. This is another colonization. And I'm sure you're familiar with this argument. I know in New Zealand it's very different because the Maori have managed a much stronger relationship and compromise with the government. But I'm always a bit mindful when people see that using right of nature is a way to decolonize law, because to quote some of the Aboriginal leaders I met, they're saying, well, not really. It's just making another colonization of nature by the legal system, which is still Western. So I'm just parking it there. I know that you probably were aware of that. And I think I'll be curious to hear you as well when you're going to look at Colombia, but also more generally in terms of the right of nature movements. There is this danger that we are going to perpetrate another form of colonization of the way we use nature. I'd be curious to hear you more on the way you hear from the Maori themselves, and especially the voices of the forest. Because the paper you sent me, and I would invite everybody to read that if you can share with everybody, because it's a great paper. You mentioned the word compromise, which, stay with me. It's on page 8 of your paper. One of the voices said, it's all about compromise. And I wonder if it's, because you talk about relational and etc., but I wonder if the word compromise is not exactly what we're facing. And in any compromise, I wonder how much you lose, when you do a compromise, there's always something to lose. So that's the first element. I'd like to hear you a little bit more on this. And it's connected also to the voices. So in your paper, you said the voices, and I wonder how unified they are, and how much it's possible for as a body to, as you said, they have to learn to work on together, but humans are humans. What did you learn from the interview? Do you feel like it's a united front? Is it going to create trouble? Are there issues of leadership? All those issues that goes inside any board. And the last question would be, I guess, more personal. For the little research I could have done in that part of the world, I felt there was a little bit of a research fatigue, maybe, that New Zealand is always used as the future of the right of nature. And some of my colleagues from the Maori academics have been telling me, we are so sick of being studied and researched. And their comment was, New Zealand is very specific, and the Maori have a very, very specific relationship with the crown that you described. And they basically kind of told me off that, it's not going to work somewhere else. This is for New Zealand. New Zealand is specific. And there's a real danger if we try to think that those models can be used in other places. Again, I put a lot of caveat at what I'm saying. I'm not necessarily agreeing with that, but just to share with you some of the criticism that that we could face with, as you said, thinking that New Zealand is the way we're going to save the world. I hope it makes sense. And maybe if you have a bit more time as well to tell us, I would be very interesting to understand the way you're going to move to Colombia and how it's going to join. And also I will put a last question there, maybe going back to the discussion we had in the first panel. Or what can we learn from places where, indigenous peoples are not there anymore? They've been either extinguished or so colonized that they're not there. I'm thinking about Europe. Are there any things we can, bring to this? Because, there are also probably philosophies we need to revive in Europe. Do you feel like in the learning with the Maoris are things that could be extrapolated on this front? So sorry, lots of questions there, Julia. But thanks again. Really enjoy reading the paper. I'm sure the PhD will be fantastic, and I hope that it will be a book soon. So keep going.
Thank you. Okay. Difficult to answer all the questions because I cannot answer on behalf of Maori. I'm going to give you my point of view from a Latin American perspective. And the first thing I need to say is that there is a plurality and diversity of opinions which are probably common, in the Maori group. They have specific politics, and the diversity is probably what they made them so rich. And also in the academia, there are different perspectives, and I can see that academics, especially Maori or especially indigenous peoples in Australia and New Zealand, most of them are saying that this is a way to the rights of nature, or the recognition of the entities, are a way to colonize not only the land, but also the philosophies and the groups. And I'm gonna cite specifically Barkan in 2019, which is an Australian researcher. However, there are other kind of academics and also people who, in this context, say that these two cases, specifically Urawera and Wanganui, are very good for the context. I probably mentioned that Tamati Kruger said it's better an agreement than nothing. And in these agreements, they are trying to push their politics, they are trying to push their philosophies and also all their struggles. Yes, it is a very difficult topic, especially when it comes from overseas, because in overseas, the rights of nature co-opted this case as part of the environmental protection. But the truth is that this case is totally different. Also the Wanganui ones. But let's see what it comes. At least contextually, I see that they are progressing. From my perspective, they are doing amazing things in the practice. Things are working. And from being from Mexico, I think it's very difficult to see that something in the law is working properly. But for the first time, I see things working properly. And there are many challenges inside the groups. I can't talk about that, but I can see that in the leaderships, there are different perspectives. And of course, some of them want to follow the same leadership. Others, which are younger, they want to forget this fight and hate against the crown and try to do more things in common. That's my perspective. But the thing is that they are very united in certain topics and in certain issues, and that's what they made them very strong. And another question was about, what do they think about being studied? Well, we believe that New Zealand is a paradigm in many things, but the truth is that once you live here, you realize it's not. They are very open. Many of the political decisions are based on political interests, I have to say it, as in many other countries. And that's my perspective from a foreigner. But there are many things that are still missing here, and there are many things that we still need to do. And when I interview these people, of course, this interview is, of course, they say, oh, there are many things, we are so bad, we have to do many things. But for me, from an outside perspective, I see that they are progressing. So if I compare to other countries, such as the Latin American one, I can see this is an example to follow in some cases, in others not. But probably if I compare it with some countries in Europe, I cannot say the same. There are different topics and different ways to measure these topics, and New Zealand is not exactly the best. Though I love New Zealand, I love this country, I love the nature. And how I'm going to compare? Well, that's a very important question because I am still discovering it. Both the cases, Colombia and Urawera, the Aotearoa River and the Urawera forest are very different when we compare them. They are very useful to study them contextually, but I think I will come up with some common things that they are sharing, especially the co-governance and how the indigenous peoples are using or are using these new tools to advance some rights. And my research is about autonomy, self-determination, mano motuhake. So I'll see how it goes. And the truth is that I'm discovering how to do the research slowly. And what can we learn from New Zealand? Oh, I think two main things. I have seen one, probably three. First is how important is life. There is a common concern about life, and that's a personal experience. And the second is to be united. It is a small country, so in cases of COVID-19 and go to lockdowns, I saw a great response of the people. But also what I admire about people here is that they are in a transition to adopt indigenous people's perspective and also the care of the nature. Nature is important here, although there are many conflicts or many problems with water quality and also quantity. But I admire that they consider they are open, the society is open, and they are learning from the nature and from the indigenous people, from Maori people. Another thing I can say to indigenous groups is that Maori is very united. It's only one language, it's only one group. But when I see all the Mayan groups in Chiapas, for example, I see them working in different directions. And I think something we can learn from Maori is to be united for a specific or for the majority of topics. And that's all. Thank you for your comments.
Well, thanks to you, Julian. Thanks for this open about the research. It was practical. Can I throw a last one at you? Sorry, just I was thinking that also you work with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And I noticed, there was some reparation, like proper damages and sum of money. Because I'm always curious about, how do you deal with the past and trauma? Was there, if I understand well, in the deeds of settlement, there was actually a payment done to the Maori for the damage done because of colonization, or is it not the way to understand this?
Well, the damage is still there, and that's one of the things they manifested, that it's difficult to suddenly in one day forget all the hundreds of years of damage, colonial damage, and jump into being colleagues, being the caretakers of the forest. So there is still there. And some of them, one of them manifested that probably is in their groups, in the governance. And that's why they want to know who they are and recognize how they are now, which have the freedom.
Maybe to open for the group, not only for you, Julia, but for everybody who's listening to us. We had this conversation last week with a few lawyers on this, and if ever we are serious about right of nature at some stage also, there might be damages, for the damage we've done to nature. And it's interesting to see how much, the Maori maybe have pushed for that. And how do we quantify the damage done to nature? And how do we redress that? It's always interesting to see how much, of the restorative justice, maybe theories can come in, how much, I don't know if much work has been done on this, but I think if ever it evolved, and your slide on reparation this is what triggered me to ask that question. Yeah, we're dealing with the present, and you had some ideas, and I like the way you frame past, present, and we have to work on this together. But I wonder to what extent, we can throw there as well some, and I'm thinking about the crime of ecocide and how much we will be able to put some damages for nature and reparation. But yeah, that's a broader question.
Well, those are some of the challenges they have. I probably set up the best panorama or the most important things that I've seen they have done, but actually there are many things to follow, and that's what I invite everyone to follow this case, because it is very important. It's making kind of different path through the government and through the two cases in New Zealand.
And sorry, I keep going, but I say it's the last one. So you mentioned the two cases, but if I'm correct, there's also a mountain now. Isn't there 3 places that have been recognized? So a forest, a river, but also a mountain, or I'm confused?
On Mount Taranaki, I think still on the go. It's not exactly a person. I don't know a lot about this case yet. Usually people mention the 3, because in the deed of settlement, it was, I think, an agreement to declare the third one, but I actually do not know a lot about this case. We always refer to the main two, which is the Whanganui River and the Urawera, both in North Ireland.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia Torres and Jérémie Gilbert, for this interesting conversation. I'm waiting to see if there's any questions maybe from the audience. You can give it a few seconds. Maybe in the meantime, Julia, was there other great walks in New Zealand that were closed down in the past, or was that the one and only case?
So far, I don't know about any other track closed by others non being part of the government. This was an announcement from Touhou, and we are used to go and pay the fee in the Department of Conservation, in the DOC website, and then we go in everywhere we go. We want to go. But here they announced, Touhou, the leader, Tamati Kruger, announced that they were going to close the Urawera, and there were already some concerns about them closing for the public access. And they closed this time the forest. The first time they didn't say why, and then a few hours later, they say, well, it's for maintenance, because probably they got the agreement with DOC. And the second is for the protection. They emphasize more on that, the protection of the vulnerable population from COVID restrictions. New Zealand wanted to vaccinate 90% of the population at least to move levels, and they were in lockdown. So they say we don't open till 90% of the population got the vaccine. And I wonder, I don't know if they got to those numbers, but it's still closed. I'm pretty sure they will open again, because it is also a good way for them to share how to relate better with the forest.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you. Okay, if there's no other questions, then it's time to say thank you to all of you, to the presenters, commentators, and participants as well for such a fruitful webinar. Today we had presentations about the rights of nature, the defense of the territory, to the forest becoming a legal entity in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we covered a huge span of issues. I thank you all very much. And after 2 afternoons or mornings, depending on where you are, it's time to say goodbye. If there's, if anybody wants to rewatch this, it's going to be on YouTube under the Rivers Project ERC YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much to all of you. Great to have you here.